Hi, I'm Tom Henschel,
I'm Sonia Jante.
And I'm Kimberly Lane.
and together we are Unlocking Leadership. We're three experienced executive coaches with very different disciplines. In every episode, we take a question from a real client and we provide key insights to address their challenge from our three different perspectives. It's a holistic approach to understand challenges and opportunities. So let's get right to it. We have our question today from Roxanne in Boston, and Roxanne writes, I've heard for years that I should, quote, think more strategically, close quote. I would if I could. What would the coaching entail? And Roxanne, I don't know if you meant this for Sonia, but this is Sonia's sweet spot. I'm so glad Sonia's with us. So Sonia, why don't you take it away?
I was going to say thank you so much. I love this question because it is something that sometimes is a mystery to many. So I guess the first thing I want to say, Roxanne, is thinking strategically is similar and yet different depending on the disciplines we're in. From a big picture perspective, thinking strategically means you take into consideration other factors than the traditional factors that are just required to do a specific job or task. So when we're thinking strategically, and just as a background to why do we need to think strategically, it's because we don't live in a world that always looks the same. We live in a world that has a lot of change. Our businesses change, functions change, technology changes, tools change. And as a result of that, we need to take that into consideration into the flow of what we're doing. If I was doing an analogy, it'd be like the recipe that you're in, and you're going to be adding a new ingredient or a new way of looking at it. When I think of the questions people normally pose for themselves when they're thinking strategically, they're trying to understand like what's going to be different about either the return on investment or the return on whatever the process is that they're doing. They're also asking the question of why. Why are we doing what we're doing? And do we need to be doing it in any other way? So depending on the function that you're in, you may be having to look at strategy from a different lens. So I'll stop there, and then I have a few more things to say, but Kimberly?
Hey, yeah, I like a great question too. I like to think of strategic thinking as just really an ability to kind of embrace 5 characteristics. And the first would just be, are you have the natural ability to kind of be thinking ahead of things? Are you always, which is a great gift to be able to anticipate potential problems versus just being so absorbed in the immediate moment, you're not really thinking ahead. The second thing I would think about, are you always asking questions? Sonia referenced, are you asking why? Kind of challenging the status quo or challenging the concept of we've already always done it this way. So is there an opportunity to improve on that or to do it differently? Are you flexible? Especially in today's very dynamic world, we have to be able to pivot. I mean, things are just changing that quickly, right? And do you have the ability just to kind of assess it's going to change and then kind of switch directions rather quickly and carry the team along with you, right? Relationally, are you able to connect the dots and see how things are related to each other, whether it's factually or the way people are interacting or whatever the context might be? And then the last thing from a characteristic perspective is really being able to put things in context, looking from how was it in the past, present, and future? So there's a lot of categories that kind of mesh together in that whole strategic thinking. So you asked the question, how can you be coached? So, that's a whole concept I think Sonia can weigh in again on as well. But I think I would start with, where are you most comfortable? Where do you feel you have the biggest strength at this point? And work with the coach to work on day-to-day issues or day-to-day challenges where maybe you could incorporate, say, some forward thinking or anticipating potential problems with this particular work or strategy at work. So those are my initial thoughts, and we'll flow it over to Tom.
Wow, you two are amazing today. So Kimberly, you talked about change. Sonia, you talked about change in a different way, and I have a question about it. The way you put it, Sonia, maybe I didn't hear it right, but you talked about it's important to that because we live in a changing world, it is important to be strategic. Can you just make that connection for me? Like, why would that necessarily be true?
Because when you're making changes, if you don't have the ability to zoom out of whatever it is that the environment is that you're in, or the relationship that you have with your client, to understand the impact of whatever the new change is going to be. I don't know if you ever heard unintended consequences. So we may say, oh, this is a great new technology that will work really well with our particular widget. But if all of the drawings that have been used for the specific client that we're working with involve something else, and they have to make a bunch of changes down in their process or their training for their people, then that has an implication. So we have to look at things differently when there is something new that we're going to be bringing into the equation, whether we're doing it, we're in control of the change, or the change is coming to us. For instance, when we had the whole COVID shutdown, we were all having to make dramatic change very quickly. And some people thought strategically and some didn't.
That's a good example.
Yeah, I like to think about, are you being proactive or you're being reactive? And I think you kind of just briefly touched on that, Sonia. Is change happening to you, or is changing happening with you? Total different sense of empowerment, total sense of kind of control of your destiny, not feeling like you're a victim to the circumstance. And I think just even having a line of sight of possibility or anticipation or awareness, really, I think it is, and not just being so it's good to be content where we're at, but it's also good to be aware of potential things that are going on, outside of our initial control circle, right? Because those eventually might come into our circle of control. And we need to be able to adapt to that. And in order that that change works out the best for us, right? That's really the whole thing about, I think, strategic thinking. It's so that when the change happens to you, it's something that is a positive thing because you've been able to accept it and incorporate the best way it can be for you, as opposed to just reacting to it and being a victim of it. It's kind of how I like to look at it.
So I want to throw out something to Roxanne as a challenge, because this is something that I talk about with people that I think is a challenge, which is you're being asked to think at an altitude, quote unquote, that you have probably never been at. You are being asked to think of questions that you cannot think of. You are being asked to see the invisible. And so often what I challenge people to do is to imagine that you work in a big high rise, it's 50 floors, and you've been working on the 5th floor. And you've really enjoyed the fact that you can kind of see over these parks over there, and there's a cafe over there, and you get to kind of look down and kind of get the flow of it. To think strategically means to think like the 47th floor. That is so different. Now you can start to imagine it, but I think it's one of the challenges of quote unquote thinking more strategically is you're trying to imagine something you've never actually seen. So I want to encourage you, aside from that idea, I'd like to encourage you to change your conversations with people and to not be talking so much about the work, but to be talk about the business, and that's just a different conversation. So that's 2 things you might try. That's what the coaching might entail.
Yeah. The other thing to think about is when I totally agree with Tom that thinking strategically when we have been very in the weeds and focused on our specific jobs, we don't have exposure to the language, to the concepts, is to see if somebody that is more like maybe on the 44th floor or the 41st floor is willing to mentor you. Exactly. I think that one of the things that really helped me to get to be more strategic was to have somebody who was in the room tell me what happened in the room and what kind of either reading material, whether it was articles or journals or books that I could read, so that I could become familiar with some of the language and some of the concepts. Oftentimes, HR will have different learning programs and development programs as they take leaders from managers to directors, directors to vice presidents. I don't know what the, order is in your organization, the titles are in your organization, Roxanne, but it would be helpful if you could look at the curriculum or what the agenda looks like when there are those kinds of meetings, because that's when you first come to the realization that there are other areas that you may not have been paying attention. That doesn't mean you don't have any knowledge or any insight into it. You just never look in that direction.
That's a great idea. I just want to say it's a really interesting concept to think that that material might be available to you if you ask, but it's not going to be like lying around in the lobby. You got to be a little proactive about it. That's a great idea, Sonia.
Exactly. The other thing that I think, one last little detail that just from a piece of humor. So sometimes at the very top levels, we hear about these strategic initiatives and that they're really going to now, and it's always about creating the future or taking the business in a new direction. When the whole COVID thing happened and we were all moved to have to work digitally, one of the leaders that I work with sent me a question that was intended for me to sort of get like a chuckle. And it was, so what was the most important, who was the biggest influence in your organization moving to a digital way of business? The CTO, the CEO, or COVID? And unfortunately, it was an event that was external that moved us into. So the fact that there were some companies that could move very fast, they probably already had a lot of that thinking, that strategic thinking going on. It just wasn't a priority. It hadn't moved into the front burner. But as a result of what happened, it did. In other places, there was never that kind of planning. And so they were caught flat-footed.
Interesting. Yeah. On the education piece, I was kind of thinking, I remember when you have your undergrad, and then if you have an opportunity to go for a master's program, that master's program typically puts you more in the vision set of that 47th floor that Tom referenced, and the ability to start thinking more as a leader, thinking the impact of decisions, to think of the long-term consequence of certain things, of implementation of various technologies, as opposed to just really literally looking at the business today. It's allowing you to, whatever industry you're in, to really have more of that strategic vision, I think, that you're trying to adopt, Roxanne. So I applaud you for, sounds like you're probably trying to apply for a leadership position or to grow within your organization. And so, kudos to you for trying to adopt some new skill sets. And I think it's going to really take some conscious effort on your part to really look at how you're facing situations today and really start introducing a simple why in most of your situations, as Sonia mentioned, to order to start having an inquisitive mind and start challenging the today's scenario, right?
I really want to just bounce off of that idea of inquisitive mind. I do think, Roxanne, I think you need to be curious. If you are not curious about what it looks like out of the 47th floor, then it doesn't matter, right? Then people can say it, but you got to, on some level, want to do it. I want to, Roxanne, if you happen to be listening as a podcast, then you do not know what happened when Sonia talked about getting a mentor that both Kimberly and I broke our necks nodding up and down. It was great radio. Couldn't see it, but yes, get a mentor. Part of what's important, what I said before about changing your conversation, changing your network too. I mean, those people are out there for you, and people know things, and they're going to help you. So think of it like a course of study. You are going to learn to think more strategically. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and I think it's one of the things, strategic thinking, I think is something that's going to be difficult just to learn through book reading. You're really going to need to work on a team project to bounce ideas off each other and to solve problems proactively and from a long-term perspective, but then also having that actual live scenario and having a mentor to walk through different scenarios and business outcomes or impacts of technology or decision making. I think that's going to really enable you to really quickly learn what you're trying to achieve. Would you guys agree?
Yeah, Kimberly brought up one of the key tools that I wanted to leave Roxanne with, and that is scenario planning. If you get good at scenario planning, and all that it requires is that you identified two, it's like you put it on a grid. You have an X grid and a Y grid, and you're able to identify what do you think would change or what would be different in the environment that you're in over the course of the next, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. And then you identify what are possibilities in each one of those quadrants. And then you can assign percentages. In the world we're living today, based on the amount of uncertainty, I challenge anybody to say, and for sure, COVID will be done on December 31st. Nobody can tell you that.
Nope.
But they can, but if you do the scenario planning, you realize what the plan of action, what the resources, and what the focus is going to be. So you can set expectations with your clients, with your team, and with yourself. Because I think that one of the hardest things is when we have put together a lot of plans and a lot of, we have a good vision and we're unable to achieve it, we beat ourselves up. But if we're living in dramatically different times, if we have different scenarios, we can say, oh, okay, it's the 20% scenario or the 40% scenario that we now need to pivot to. Thanks for the question.
Yes. And thank you, Roxanne from Boston, for your question today. And we've given you some great tidbits and tools to move forward between getting a mentor, between scenario planning, and also being inquisitive. So we hope you and our viewers and listeners gain really new insights on how to think more strategically today. To our listeners, if you really like the content we shared today, please post a review on this episode, and also share and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Unlocking Leadership, Ask the Coaches. If you have a leadership question or would like to reach out to one of our coaches, please find the contact information and website in the new show notes. Thanks for joining us today. Tune in next time to find the keys to unlocking your best leadership.
Thank you.
Bye.